Hello everyone, this is MythrilZenith and welcome to Unit Design 101. I've collected all 16 episodes from 2024 into this definitive cut for your enjoyment. Almost 2 hours straight of dry Fire Emblem unit design analysis for you to fall asleep to, with a special message at the end for those of you who made it through awake. There are no sponsors for this channel except my wonderful channel members whose donations have helped motivate and keep me sane this year throughout producing these videos and more. So before we get on with the uninterrupted class, I would like to thank Royal Leguzguard member, The Forgotten L, and Leguzguard members C2 Peekly, Enigmatic Mr. L, Mad Moke, Bro Duderman, Kumi, Miss Mesmerism, Lacag, Relaz6, Salmelon, and Inside Chaos. Thank you so much for your support throughout this difficult year. Now, I won't interrupt the unit design content anymore, so please like, subscribe, and enjoy. This week, we're taking a look at early game archers, why they're considered weak and worthless by the greater community, and what factors lead them to being more useful. The early game archer is often the first specialized combat unit that you have access to. They don't have non-combat utility such as flying or healing, and because bows are usually locked to 2 range, most archers cannot attack adjacent foes, meaning they often can only attack on player phase. This is counterbalanced by archers usually being the first dealers of effective damage in your army beyond your lord's rapier, because bows deal effective damage against flyers such as Pegasus Knights. Those are all of the static features of an early game archer. Stat-wise, they tend to be fairly average, often with lower strength or speed, but usually with a decent skill stat. Their defenses are usually a bit on the lower end, but they're not usually so fragile that they can't take a hit or two. They almost always join within the first 2 or 3 chapters, and are sometimes part of the initial team. Because of the way archers are designed, their value often lies not just in their own stats, but in the importance of their niche. Early game archers excel at dealing damage in ways that other units can't, either by attacking units that can't counter back, or by dealing significant damage to units like flyers who otherwise might be difficult to take down. Archers find this niche easily in games with uncommon or ineffective 1-2 range options for your other units, or in games where early flyers are common and particularly threatening. The stats of an early game archer only matter insofar as they allow the archer to hit accurately and deal enough damage to effectively defeat flyers. Often, the early archer tends to be left behind when their niche becomes unimportant. If your army gets other ways to effectively deal damage at range, or if enemy flyers are non-existent or not particularly threatening, then players will tend to drop early archers first, before benching other units that they consider more core to their army. This often leads to situations where early archers are used in the early game just to deal chip damage to key targets, but rarely end up getting kills themselves, leading to them not leveling up and being benched earlier. It's a thankless job to set up kills, but someone has to do it. Archers are most useful in games such as Shadow Dragon, New Mystery of the Emblem, and Engage, particularly on higher difficulties where their niche is more meaningful. Units such as Gordon or Etier are often used for a few chapters to assist with difficult bosses that happen to be locked to 1 range, or one-shotting flyers that would take other units multiple attacks to kill. Despite being very important for the first few chapters, even these archers are often abandoned a few chapters later because their niche is no longer useful, or their stats have been surpassed by better units. It's not uncommon for a pre-promoted sniper, like George, to join you and fill in the early archer's niche better in the mid-game with less investment. Gaiden and Shadows of Valentia make archers into training projects. They have lower stats and more limited weapon access than other unit types early on, but, if trained, are given access to powerful options that few other units get access to, such as the Bow Knight's 5-6 tile attack range, or SOV's Hunter's Volley on Killer Bow. This ends up having more overlap with Trainees than most other early archers, so I do not consider this to be a core trait of early archers, though it is an option for them for long-term viability. Some games, such as Radiant Dawn or Vestaria Saga 1, have early archers that are useful for chip damage early on, but then are given unique weapons deeper into the game to maintain their usefulness. The Lugnasad for Leonardo or the Bow of Aragoth for Dune are powerful rewards for training these units, but even if they haven't been trained, these personal weapons still can extend their ability to contribute in the more difficult chapters where you may need someone who can safely attack at range. Games where early archers feel generally useless often lack a valuable need for their niche. Often, javelins and hand axes are plentiful and accurate, or enemies are weak enough that weakening without counters is not necessary. Sometimes the core mechanics of a game, such as the lower effective damage rate in FE7 and FE9, can also limit archers' usefulness. Some other features can increase the usability of archers even if their niche is not valued. Access to quick and effective support bonuses, such as Namies with Colm, can help them deal more damage at higher accuracy and smooth out their training arc. Terrain features like ledges in Radiant Dawn, or ballistas in GBA and Tellius, can provide additional map-specific niches beyond accurate 2 range and flyer effective damage. However, some archers can still suffer even in games where the overall design says they should succeed. Wolt in Fire Emblem 6, for example, has too low skill to be perfectly accurate in the early game, and the threatening Wyverns of Chapter 7 are far too strong to be effectively killed by Wolt alone. He still provides value with 2 range access in a game that has both limited access to and highly inaccurate javelins and hand axes, and this is still valuable because enemies are so strong, but he does tend to fall off faster than other archers in similar situations because of his accuracy and damage issues. So to sum it all up, what have we learned about archers? First, their effective damage needs to be meaningful. If you want a good archer, put some flyers in the early game. Second, their 2 range needs to be meaningful, meaning if you want a good archer, you should limit or weaken javelins and hand axes. Third, their stats only matter relative to the enemy flyers and expected enemy avoid, meaning if you want archers to be useful, skill is very important, and strength is important mostly if enemy flyers have high hit points or defense. Fourth, you should expect players to bench them when their niche is no longer useful. This means that an effective archer doesn't necessarily need to be a long-term unit. However, if you want an archer to be a long-term unit, the long-term value they provide should be unique, such as massive range or unique skills. And that's it for this week's lesson on archers. This week we are taking a look at Myrmidons, the challenges facing sword-locked infantry, what unique attributes can make them stand out, and why many players feel that Mercenary is the superior unit class in most situations. The Myrmidon is a sword-locked infantry unit notable for having very high speed and skill. Their other stats vary from unit to unit, but are usually fairly average, and they tend to have slightly lower defenses than other physical units. A Myrmidon usually promotes into Swordmaster, a class still limited to swords, but that gains higher critical rate and or the Astra proc skill to compensate. Myrmidons fill a somewhat narrow role in a player's army. Often the fastest and most accurate units you have, particularly in the early game, they usually have a strong matchup against axe fighters, being able to avoid their attacks and double them back. They have an incredibly weak matchup against armor knights, unless given an armor slayer or magical sword, as their low strength combined with the low might of swords often leaves them incapable of dealing significant damage against these high defense opponents. The Myrmidon class is perhaps the class most impacted by the weapon triangle in all of Fire Emblem, as both its naturally strong and naturally weak matchups align with the triangle's bonuses and penalties for swords. Extra evasion and damage stacks notably well against fighters, when the Myrmidon's game plan is to avoid and double, and any amount of damage lost against a high defense unit, such as a knight, is a much higher percentage of the total damage lost. Being limited to swords often restricts the Myrmidon's ability to attack at range. Most games have very few 1-2 range swords, and the ones that they do have are often magical, limited, or only available in the late game. Because of this, Myrmidons tend to be attacked by enemy archers much more often, being both unable to counter and taking significant damage back due to their low defense. To make up for the sword's lack of ranged options, Myrmidons have historically been specialized towards either critical hits or skill activations to deal more damage at closer range. This often takes the form of having a weapon with innate crit, such as a Killing Edge, in their starting inventory, or having damage boosting skills, such as Aira's Astra, Holland's Luna, or Felix's Crest of Fraldarius. However, many of these bonuses for most Myrmidons only apply to the promoted Swordmaster class, giving unpromoted Myrmidons a slight feeling of being a trainee type of class in the worst situations. Before going any deeper on Myrmidons, we must mention Mercenaries. Before Fire Emblem 6, Mercenaries and Myrmidons were, for all intents and purposes, the same class, but after Fire Emblem 6, Mercenaries became the more well-rounded sword infantry, with higher base stats across the board, but lower speed and skill, and a promotion to hero giving axes. Myrmidons, in turn, became more specialized, losing some general bulk and strength for a more specific focus on skill and speed, and promoting into Swordmaster, with higher speed and skill caps and a greater focus on critical hits. This split seems reasonable, but it tends to go unfavorably for the Myrmidon, especially in games with weaker enemies. The extra versatility of having higher average bases and getting access to axes on promotion made Mercenary and Hero a much more solid jack-of-all-trades infantry class, with enough speed to double, enough skill to hit, enough strength to deal meaningful damage, and enough bulk to survive enemy hits. For a Myrmidon to stand out, their higher speed and skill needs to be meaningful. However, speed is a threshold stat, and if the Mercenary is hitting the doubling threshold, then the extra speed of the Myrmidon means only a little more avoid. Meanwhile, skill is a compounding stat, so a few extra points doesn't make a significant difference in terms of hit or crit rates most of the time. This is one reason why Myrmidons in games with stronger enemies, such as Fire Emblem 6, tend to be looked upon more favorably, or at least equivalent to mercenaries, as the few extra points in speed and skill, in addition to extremely favorable crit rates and hard mode bonuses in FE6's case, can make a meaningful difference over a mercenary's generally above average stat setup. In modern Fire Emblem games, the Vantage skill has become their signature trait. This skill allows a unit to counter before the enemy attacks, though often with some restrictions, such as the unit needing to be below 50% HP. The skill rewards players who are willing to play risky, putting Myrmidons at low HP in order to defeat enemies without taking direct attacks. Myrmidons often are not the best users of this skill, however, as being locked to one range and often requiring a crit or another skill proc to defeat the enemy in a single blow can mean that in many situations the skill does not provide value. However, in games where skills can be learned permanently and then transferred to other classes, the Vantage skill makes Myrmidon a useful part of many leveling paths, as it is a key component of many enemy phase focused skill builds, usually including other threshold skills such as Wrath, Resolve, or Defiant skills. A good Myrmidon often requires some help from the game to set up optimal combat situations for them. Mystery of the Emblem and Thracia 776 force mounted units to dismount inside of buildings, allowing Myrmidons to be stronger and more mobile for certain chapters. Fire Emblem 4 gives Myrmidons powerful proc skills such as Astra or Luna, and combined with their low weight of swords and the defense bypassing effect of critical hits, this makes them into very effective arena grinders and boss killers, at the cost of being less mobile and less versatile compared to cavalry. Fire Emblem 6 gives Swordmasters 30% bonus critical chance instead of the now standard 15%, on top of having enemies with much higher speed and luck than many other games, meaning Myrmidons and Swordmasters are often some of the only units in your army capable of hitting, doubling, and critting, even over mercenaries and heroes. That said, Fire Emblem 6 is unique because all of the Myrmidons you get are recruited red units, while all of the mercenaries you get are not, leading to only Myrmidons getting hard mode bonuses, so some may say this is not a fair comparison. A bad Myrmidon is one whose niche of speed and skill is not valued, or one who suffers from bad matchups constantly. Shadow Dragon DS is full of Cavaliers and Armor Knights that use lances, and has an extreme form of the weapon triangle, making Myrmidons a poor class choice for most units before the high speed cap of Swordmasters makes them viable for late game. Path of Radiance has Myrmidons who provide a rather weak combat compared to being less mobile and less versatile than most other units in your army. Radiant Dawn Edward does not start with enough speed to double, or enough bulk to survive more than one hit, and these issues compound with a lack of weapon triangle on hard mode, preventing him from capitalizing on the few good matchups he might have early on. Most games feature Myrmidons who are not bad, but are often overlooked because their niche is not important enough to sacrifice other units' versatility. Guy, Joshua, Zahark, Lonku, Hana, and Lapis are not generally bad units, but their lack of versatility relative to other units often limits their usefulness, as their speed or killing potential is not valuable enough in their games to give up the versatility of a different weapon type or higher movement range. Despite all of these issues, Myrmidons are often fan-favorite characters for many players. This tends to be because of player psychology and presentation rather than any mechanical feature of the Myrmidon, and while this series is about mechanical function more than flavor and feel, there is something to be said about a unit with high evasion and high critical chance that can make them stand out from the crowd in the player's mind and heart. Low enemy chances to hit, and high player chances to crit provide a gambling-like rush for some players, allowing Myrmidons to feel like unkillable gods, useless scrubs, or anything in between simply because of their interaction with the RNG. So, what have we learned about Myrmidons? First, their speed and critical hits are their niche. If you want a strong Myrmidon, feature weak bandits or strong bosses. Second, they have a higher weapon triangle impact than other units, so think very carefully about the weapon type distribution you have in your game. Third, Myrmidons have a lack of versatility, meaning you need to make them stand out in other ways, usually through their combat skills. Fourth, if offering a powerful skill, players may take the skill and leave the class line, as seen with Vantage. Fifth, players will tend to have strong opinions about your Myrmidons. If you embrace this fully, some players may make fun of you for it, but others will find their favorite characters in all of Fire Emblem. And that's it for this week's lesson on Myrmidons. This week we are going to take a look at Wyvern Knights, their journey from being a flying tank to being the most broken unit type in the series, and how reclassing has made their dominance outright oppressive. The Wyvern Knight most Fire Emblem fans are familiar with is downright busted, embodying the best of almost every physical unit, the high bulk of an Armor Knight, the flying mobility of a Pegasus Knight, and the strength and versatility of a Paladin. Their only lacking points tend to be speed, though that's often average at worst and is sometimes still very solid, and resistance, which is almost always their lowest stat. This is magnified by Fire Emblem's tendency to reward generalist units far more than it rewards specialist units. Much like the Mercenary versus Myrmidon debate from my previous video, the Wyvern Knight's high stats and mobility make it at least equal to, if not better than, most other units at most jobs, only truly lacking the ability to use magic, heal, or sometimes survive archer fire, though in some games that's not even a real problem. However, if you look back to the very beginning, Wyvern Riders were mostly established as flying tanks. With high mobility and defense, but somewhat lacking speed, the OG Wyverns such as FE1 Minerva and FE4 Altena often needed some assistance to go from durable flyer to all-around killing machine. So how did we get to the age of truly dominant Wyverns? Well, we have two units to thank: FE3 Minerva and FE5 Dean. Where FE1 Minerva had 6 speed and 3 skill, FE3's Book 2 Minerva had 15 speed, 16 defense, and other stats to match. And remember, this is in a game where the max of any stat outside of hit points was 20, and she joined on Chapter 9. Meanwhile, Thracia 776's Dean was the progenitor of what we think of a Wyvern Lord today. Solid stats all around, a great personal weapon if you can manage to get to it, and still tons of levels to grow with some solid growth rates, at least by Thracia standards. By the time we got to FE6 Melody, Wyvern dominance was in full force, but since it was still limited to 1, maybe 2 units per game, they didn't tend to break the game. Sure, Melody with Narshan's Delphi shield can fly over all of Sakai without taking damage, but the enemy Wyverns in Chapter 21 still posed a threat to her. She can't win the entire game on her own, at least not effortlessly. She's not Har. FE10 Har, specifically. Unlike Jill, who needed some serious investment of stat boosters and bonus EXP to truly start becoming a powerhouse, Har was a win button from moment one. He had some of the best availability in the game thanks to Radiant Dawn's split army structure, and outside of being a little low on speed to start, and taking bonus damage from Thunder Mages, who were nerfed from Path of Radiance to be weaker and less accurate, he was strong enough with very little investment to dominate almost every chapter he existed in, with the exception of the endgame, which, combined with a map design that was very cruel to landlocked units, meant he was almost always your best solution to any problem. But again, Har was still just one unit. An interesting change to mention about FE10 specifically was that this was the first game to change the main weapon of Wyvern Riders from lances to axes. Axes in early Fire Emblem were historically bad, sporting high damage but low hit rates, which would coincide well with a flying tank class, heavy, slow, high damage, but unreliable. However, throughout the GBA and into the Tellius games, axes were steadily buffed, becoming more and more accurate and having their weight easier to cover for. Eventually, axes just became better than lances, and with swords still having limited versatility, axes became the best weapon type, roughly coinciding with FE10's shifting Wyverns to be primarily axe users. What truly created the Wyvern Knight dominance that so many players seem sick of today, however, is reclassing. While early reclassing placed limits on how many units of a particular class you could have, either through hard class limits in DSFE or limited options in Awakening and Fates, the entire open reclassing system of 3 houses and engage have led to a rate of Wyverns appearing that is nothing short of nauseating for many players. Instead of looking at Setith or Ivy or Rosado as the Wyvern representation of these games, we instead look to the entire roster and ask, would you be better as a Wyvern Rider? And without the proper need for the niches of other classes, the all-star generalist class of the Wyvern Rider feels like a no-brainer to many, many players. I call this issue centralizing design, where one option is so dominant that, even if it's not technically the best option, it's so easy to get to, easy to use, or easy to win with that most players will just use it and ignore the rest of the game. Wyvern Knights, in open reclassing games, are perhaps the pinnacle of centralizing design in the entire Fire Emblem series, and this represents a problem that will continue to eat away at the entire series, in my opinion, as long as it exists. So if reclassing is the problem, how can Wyverns be balanced in games that feature it? Well, reclassing, particularly open reclassing, demands a lot on the class balance side of things to make every single class feel valuable. However, with the Wyvern Knight being fairly strong across the board, despite not being the absolute best in any one area, it takes a surprising amount of effectiveness in one particular area to overturn the Wyvern as the easy answer to most problems. For a Swordmaster to be better than a Wyvern, for instance, their speed or melee combat advantages need to be much stronger to make up for their weapon and movement limitations, but not so much stronger that they become an effective general solution to any problem. For a Sniper to be better, their niche of higher range or flying effective damage must be rewarded by the map design. I could sit here and list examples for every unit type, but at the end of the day, the Wyvern Knight is just so solid of an answer as it is now that it cannot be overturned without either making specialists so incredibly valuable that all your players will feel forced to include them and the army composition will turn homogeneous again, or making another class so overpowered that everyone switches to it instead of Wyverns, or completely changing what the Wyvern even is. At this point, Unit Design 101 has effectively run its course. Class will be dismissed once I give my summary, but I wanted to say that I will be continuing this discussion in a follow-up video next week, talking about a variety of topics that didn't quite fit into this video, such as how Wyvern Knights represent enemy factions, and the concept of imbalance as texture, so stay tuned for that. But before we go, what have we learned today? First, Wyvern Riders were always good, but they weren't always dominant. Look at the examples of FE1 Minerva and FE4 Altena for reasons why. Second, Fire Emblem's mechanics heavily favor generalist units, and the Wyvern Knight is the king of the generalists. Third, without reclassing, Wyverns can be strong, but can't do everything on their own. Fourth, with reclassing, players tend to lean into the easiest strategy for victory, and if it isn't Wyverns, it's gonna be something else. Fifth, balancing a generalist is incredibly difficult, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try. This week we are looking at Manaketes, the transforming children who massacre dragons and monsters effortlessly, but rarely contribute much else, and asking where they've all gone. The Manakete is a unique unit type in Fire Emblem not present in every game, and when they are present, usually only get one or two. Instead of attacking with weapons or magic, they use dragon stones to gain stat bonuses and deal heavy damage, usually with a focus on effective damage against other dragons. Manaketes tend to appear fairly late in their games and with very low base stats, usually made up for by the very large stat bonuses given by their dragon stones. Despite being considered a staple of the series, Manaketes only show up in 7 games, 8 if you count transforming classes and fates, and 4 of those games are different remakes of Arcanea's story. For this video, I will not be considering the Lagoos of Teleus, but I will mention Taguel, Kitsune, and Wolfskin as they are branches off the same core identity. Dragon stones are a key part of a Manakete's flavor and function. Depending on the game, they can operate very differently from each other. In Fire Emblem 1, dragon stones were infinite use, gave a large boost to defense, and effectively had a very high base weapon might. In Fire Emblem 3, Dragonstones were consumables that when used would transform the Manakete for several turns using a single charge, granting increases to all stats and access to breath weapons, while an untransformed Manakete was effectively useless. Starting in FE6 and carrying forward through every other iteration, Dragonstones were basically just weapons that granted high stat bonuses when equipped, consuming durability with each attack the dragon made. Dragonstones in these games tended to be extremely powerful, but because you usually only received one, and it could not be repaired even by Hammern, they often trigger hoarding mentality and limit a Manakete's ability to see constant combat. The only change that Fates made was removing durability, the same it did with every weapon. So with Dragonstone in hand, what role do Manaketes serve in a player's army? Well, there are a few possibilities that Fire Emblem has explored. First, and least popular, is the Fire Dragon, represented by Bantu, a mid-game filler unit with decent bulk and nothing else going on for him. While the Firestone bonuses allow a Fire Dragon to surpass their normal stat caps, their growths are often terrible, and their starting stats aren't that much better. They also don't deal effective damage to other dragons, except for FE3 where Fire Dragons dealt effective damage specifically against Ice Dragons. Beyond using the Fire Emblem 1 promotion glitch to infinitely boost his defense, or being an emergency unit that doesn't need to use weapons, Fire Dragon Manakete serves little unique purpose to a player's army. Next, and far more popular, is the Divine Dragon Manakete, typified by Tiki but represented by Fae, Myr, and Nagi as well. A Divine Dragon usually joins late and horribly under-leveled, but with absolutely massive stat bonuses, particularly in defense and resistance, granted by their Divine Dragonstone that make them easier to use and level up. Their stat growths are often very good, notably with high hit points and defense growths, and since they are calculated as unpromoted units and joined deep into the game, they tend to level up very quickly if you feed kills to them. While you get them in the mid-game, their true value is often seen towards the end-game, where they have a very strong matchup against the powerful enemies, usually dragons, that tend to fill late-game chapters. Some Divine Dragonstones also deal dragon-effective damage against enemy Wyvern riders too, though not all of them do. In the case of Tiki and Myr, they're strong enough at base to one-shot almost any enemy that they deal effective damage to. This is why their growths are focused in HP and defense, so you are rewarded for training them early by letting them roam free, but you don't need to train them to get use out of them. Interestingly, in FE3 specifically, Manaketes were the only units whose defense reduced the damage of dragon attacks, making Tiki not just an effective dragon slayer, but also the only one who could survive multiple dragon attacks reliably. In Faye's case, while she's not strong enough to one-shot endgame dragons at base, and her version of the Divine Stone isn't effective against enemy Wyverns, her massive resistance boost in particular allowed her to be a very effective soak for enemy status staves and siege tomes. However, her starting HP was very low, as well as her speed, meaning she was likely to die to bolting sages in hard mode without some investment like an angelic robe. A third and experimental branch of the Manakete family showed up in Awakening, and shares heavy overlap with the Togwell, Kitsune, and Wolfskin. By using Dragonstones as an ordinary weapon type, and allowing them to be purchased, with stronger versions like the Dragonstone Plus existing later on, Manaketes such as Noe or Adult Tiki began to feel more like generalist units, having permanent 1-2 range and decent stats overall, but at the cost of having no access to other weapon types unless reclassed, and a dragon effective weakness that followed them even when they were reclassed. The exceptionally high growths of previous Divine Dragon Manaketes were lost, and their dragon effectiveness was turned into the Wormbane skill, which did at least let them deal effective damage against Wyvern riders as well as dragons. In mentioning the Togwell, Kitsune, and Wolfskin, these can be summarized by effectively being the same from a design standpoint as the Awakening Manaketes, but they were locked to one range instead of 1-2, and they gained skills to deal effective damage against cavalry instead of against dragons. And speaking of fates, the final game to give us a playable Dragonstone user came in the form of the Nor and Hoshido Noble class lines, where the Dragonstone was a weapon option, providing heavy defensive bonuses, but was locked to one range and couldn't double, acting as an option for Core and Arcana to tank more hits at the cost of usually killing fewer enemies. So, with less than half of all Fire Emblem games having Manaketes, and most of the ones that do handling them very differently, is there really one singular identity for this unit type? Well, not in the traditional sense. So, instead of generalizing what Manaketes add to your game, let's consider what holes Manaketes can be used to fill. First, Fire Dragons can be an early wall with planned obsolescence, replacing or supplementing any Jagan archetype that you may have. Second, Divine Dragons are late-game solutions, with optional mid-game training arcs, filling the desire of many players to have a pet project after their early-game trainees have either been promoted or benched. Third, Awakening Dragons are an anti-dragon generalist with a unique weapon progression, giving options to provide rare and powerful weapons that won't necessarily break the game because so few units can use them. And fourth, Fate's Dragonstone is a defensive tool, used to either weaken enemies without killing them, or to provide a sudden boost in bulk for an army that might not otherwise have it. And that's it for this week's lesson on Manaketes. This week we're taking a look at mages, the reason why they're so often good, and why making them weaker without making them totally outclassed is so difficult. If you're interested in a deep dive on how magic works and its changes throughout the series, check out my Mechanics Design 101 on magic. I won't cover any of that in this video, so consider that a primer for this discussion. The strong points of mages are their natural 1-2 range on most weapons, attacks hitting resistance instead of defense, and the additional staff utility that they often get on promotion. In exchange for this, mages tend to have lower physical bulk in the form of HP and defense rather than other units, and often have lower skill than most physical units, though this is made up for by the high base accuracy of most early tomes. The best mages tend to stand out in one of two ways. The first is by becoming a glass cannon, one-rounding enemies so effectively that their lower bulk doesn't matter. Lysithea is often the poster child for this, but many mages across the series have been viable glass cannons. FE1 Lind, Sarah, Lute, Nyx, and Citrine all have potential to one-round enemies at the cost of their lower bulk. To consistently do so means that their magic growth needs to keep up with enemy HP and resistance, and in more complex games you may need to use forges, skills, or other things to keep that power high. The other way mages become powerful is by overcoming their traditionally low bulk and becoming enemy phase viable generalists. The best mages of the GBA and 3DS era tend to have this as their ideal endgame. Mages like Asbel and Lu, sages like Wendell, Sed, Pent, and Selah, shamans like Kanas, and any sorcerer Nosferatu build can capitalize on the slight sacrifice of raw power compared to their glass cannon cousins with significantly better survivability, be that through dodging, self-healing, or just raw defense. This is also where you'll find the endgame archmagi like Goto and Athos, well-rounded and capable, but without the raw power to one-round most foes. Any mage that can't reliably build towards either of these two ideals can still see use thanks to the flexibility of tomes or the utility of staves. Despite not being game-defining, most mages such as Merrick, Bowie, May, Ray, Hugh, Lilina, Soren, Hubert, and Clan have plenty of viability and useful niches that they can help in without feeling like a wasted deployment slot, assuming you're actively training them. Below these lie the forbidden land of late-game training projects like Miranda, Sophia, Nino, Ewan, and Tormod. Mage is a great class for units like this, again because of magic's flexibility. They aren't limited to only fighting archers at 1 range, or only fighting soldiers at 2 range for their early levels. They can do both, and with the high accuracy of weak tomes like fire, and the generally low resistance of most enemy types, you can usually easily feed these late game mages a couple of kills, and they get a ton of experience for only a little effort because of their low starting level. These units tend to be more of a novelty than actual utility, as while their potential is very high, the time it takes for them to get there usually means that they only see a handful of maps at most near their full power, even with the most dedicated grind. So if it makes good units fantastic, middling units good, and bad units usable, mage must be a great class, right? Most of the time, yes. In fact, one could argue that being a mage is a strict upgrade to being almost any other type of unit in most situations, and I wouldn't necessarily say that they're wrong. However, that all depends on the power of tomes and the resistance of enemies. Path of Radiance and Radiant Dawn boosted the resistance of most enemies, while also crippling the might of most tomes, which, when combined with a number of other targeted nerfs to the mage class, specifically meant that being a mage in those games ended up feeling like a strict downgrade rather than an upgrade. Some units like Micaiah still made it work in their favor, but when a unit built to be a glass cannon mage is unable to one-round except with a busted personal tome with crazy effective damage, you know that the game is probably being pretty rude to mages. The biggest limitation of a mage is usually their mobility. While the Mage Knight or Flying Hybrid class bypasses this limitation at the cost of staff utility, the footlocked mage and sage tend to fall behind the rest of your army except on desert maps where that mobility balance flips. Utility such as long-range magic or physics staves can help footlocked mages contribute after they fall behind, but siege tomes are very rare and often lack the ability to kill enemies on their own. As such, mages are best thought of as coming in behind the main force to clean up high defense survivors, rather than as the core of your army in most situations. So, what are the takeaways about mages? First, unless you severely limit the power of magic to the point of near uselessness, being a mage is significantly better for most units than being a physical unit, particularly for those with weaker starting stats. Second, glass cannon mages are very popular and very powerful, but they only last as long as they can one-round. Third, giving a mage high bulk magnifies their magic power. The only bulky mages who aren't considered good have very poor magic stats, spell list, or availability. And 4, mage is a good class for offense and utility, but suffers in mobility and defense, making them effective combat support, cleanup crew, or boss killers, rather than being the main force of your army. If you want to learn more about the ways magic is treated in Fire Emblem, check out the Mechanics Design 101 on magic. If you want to learn more about the ways mages were nerfed in Tellius, watch Why Tellius Sucked for mages. This week we're talking about Armor Knights, the reason defense is valued at a premium, and the true value of movement and versatility. Of all the units in Fire Emblem, none wear their identity on their sleeve quite as clearly as the Armor Knight. High defense, solid strength, low speed, resistance, and mobility. Enemy armors are often set to block gates, thrones, bridges, and other points of importance. On the player side of things, Armor Knights are usually lambasted for their weaknesses, particularly in speed and mobility, far more than praising their benefits. There are multiple reasons for this, but chief among them are map design and the design of the defense stat. Briefly touching on the map design side of things, Armor Knights are generally disincentivized because the majority of Fire Emblem maps put the player on the offense. Choke points are occasionally important to hold while the rest of your army moves forward, and defend maps flip this aggressive posture somewhat, but in general, the average experience of an Armor Knight is slowly falling behind your army unless you deliberately let them set the pace, or the enemies you face are so strong that you can't clear with your most mobile forces at full distance. We'll come back to mobility in just a minute, but first I wanted to talk about the defense stat. Supposedly an Armor Knight's biggest strength, defense is one of Fire Emblem's most unique core design aspects. A linear subtraction of damage taken in a low numbers game is incredibly powerful, such that many tactics games reserve any form of direct damage reduction solely to specialized units or equipment. Viewing Fire Emblem's Armor Knight in this way, in my opinion, is a mistake. This is because defense is not a feature limited to Armor Knights. All units have defense and can gain more as they level up. An Armor Knight's base defense is typically higher than other units relative to their join chapter and level, but the defense growth of an Armor Knight is typically fairly average, oftentimes even behind the defense growth of other unit types. Going back to the original FE1, for instance, the highest defense growth of the game at 50% was shared between two units, Board and Barst, Axe Fighters. Drog, or Doga, the iconic choker of points, has a base defense growth of only 10%. And yes, growths don't tell the whole story, but I feel like it's emblematic of two key points. First, Armor Knights have their most significant advantage in bulk in the early stages of the game before unit growths have a chance to add up. And second, that Kaga's initial design was very insistent on not allowing units to cap defense too early. Defense is a compounding stat. The more you have, the more valuable every additional point is. A 30 hit point unit taking 9 damage per hit will die in 4 hits. Give them 3 points of defense and they die in 5 hits. Give them 3 more and they die in 10. And after 3 more, they won't take any damage at all. An Armor Knight gaining a few extra points in defense in the early game would quickly become a literally unkillable unit, so it is in the best interest of the game to prevent that. Why? Well, high defense units slow the game down and limit how many real threats a player faces. Most game designers would rather create a 15-minute level where the player is having to constantly avoid danger, than a 30-minute level where the player is never in any danger at all. Playing with invincible Armor Knights can be satisfying for a time, but if you have a unit who is never in any danger, then nothing's stopping you from soloing the game with that unit, trivializing the game's potential difficulty and making all other strategic decisions unnecessary or irrelevant. For an example of this in action, consider Wolf and Sedgar in the DS version of Shadow Dragon. When reclassed to General, these units' defense growths become so incredibly high that they're practically guaranteed to cap defense. With a bit of dedication to an early grind setup, you can easily create 2 units that take basically no damage from enemy physical units until endgame, so much so that they can trivialize the entire game even on hard 5 difficulty. This is why defense usually comes at such a high cost, namely in stats that provide very notable weaknesses: speed, resistance, and mobility. Speed acts as both an offensive and defensive tool, and lacking it means a unit like an Armor Knight will take twice as much damage and deal half as much than they otherwise would from every encounter. Add in low resistance, and mages become incredibly potent counters to Armor Knights, bypassing their high defense entirely and doing more damage against armors on average than against most other unit types. Low mobility, though, is the real sticking point for most players. Videos have been made arguing about whether giving Armor Knights extra mobility would fix them, but while that's an interesting argument to make, we do need to talk about what mobility really does for a unit in Fire Emblem. Mobility at its most basic determines how far a unit can move. In a straight race across an open field, a unit with 8 mobility will outpace a unit with 4 by double every turn. But Fire Emblem rarely has open field with no enemies to run around in. In this case, mobility could be better understood as placement versatility. A unit with 8 mobility has a longer attack range than a unit with 4, and even if that unit has to stop once they attack, they can use that mobility next turn to attack further in, retreat farther away, or so on. A unit with high mobility does not have to commit to any single direction as much as a unit with low mobility does. A unit who has higher mobility than their opponents can run away. A unit with less mobility has to fight, whether they start getting overwhelmed or not. An Armor Knight's low mobility is far less about falling behind the rest of your army, though that is still meaningful because of the high number of offensive-focused maps in Fire Emblem, and far more about becoming committed to one particular area of the map. Arden can pick up the pursuit ring, but he probably won't make it back in time to fight at the next castle. Doga will choke this point, but he won't be able to get to that other point in time to block the enemies there as well. So, with that overview of the issues that most Armor Knights face out of the way, how have some managed to push out of obscurity and into the limelight? Fire Emblem 7's Oswin is just far stronger at base than most other armors are. In a game where most of your other units are struggling to survive taking multiple hits at base, Oswin steps in to tank for however long you need him to, and with a large number of flanking reinforcements in most chapters, there will usually be something for him to fight even once your more mobile units come online and race ahead. In Radiant Dawn, Toronio and Gatry stand apart through their stats. Having high stats across the board, including in areas armors normally lack such as speed and resistance, makes fielding them feel far less punishing. Though they still struggle to travel where they're most needed, they feel powerful and impactful wherever they end up. In Fate's Conquest, Effie is often considered one of the best Armor Knights because her job as a high durability tank is actually valuable, and she does it well. High strength and defense make her stand out because of the relatively low durability of most other units, and the late game addition of Wary Fighter can eliminate the issue of doubling altogether. Engage tried a different tactic for armor units that seemed to work well on first play, at least until the meta was figured out. By eliminating break as a concern, Armor Knights like Louis could fight multiple foes with mixed weapon types on enemy phase while still dealing some damage back. On higher difficulties, Armor Knights tended to be paradoxically less useful in Engage thanks to rampant enemy stat scaling, smarter AI that ignores units that take no damage, and the prevalence of backup units for chain attacks, but the concept of making armors enemy phase specialists was a step in an interesting direction. So, what does that mean for Armor Knights? First, defense is incredibly game warping if a unit can get enough of it. Second, mobility for armors is all about commitment more than raw travel. Third, armors are defined by their weaknesses because their strengths aren't unique. And fourth, carving out a niche for armors may involve letting them break the normal rules of the game. I hope you enjoyed this look at Armor Knights. This week we follow up on Armor Knights to discuss Great Knights, the mounted Armor Knight with a lot of fans and a lot of problems. Now, Great Knights come in two very different forms. The first is simply the promoted class of the Axe Knight in FE4, FE5, and Radiant Dawn. These are not interesting beyond being mounted axe builders, and are not what this video is concerned with. The modern Great Knight was created in Fire Emblem 8, and while it skipped Tellius in the Arcanea remakes, it has been in every game since Awakening. Having both the armor and cavalry tags, Great Knights represent a halfway between the two, the extra movement and flexibility of cavalry combined with the heavy bulk and higher stat caps of armor, though surpassing neither in their specific abilities. The most unique positive trait of the Great Knight is their control over the weapon triangle. Wielding swords, lances, and axes in every iteration outside of Engage means that they have full control over the weapon triangle, a trait shared only by certain versions of generals, paladins, masters of arms, and maybe a few DLC classes. How important controlling the weapon triangle is varies from game to game, but flexibility in being able to equip almost any weapon is quite good. The class also has fairly solid base stats, lacking only in speed and resistance, and even those not as poor as generals most of the time. This is to be expected from a promoted class, but it should be noted that stats are a major selling point for this class. The downsides of Great Knights are their lower movement compared to other cavalry, except for in Engage, and the double weakness to both armor and cavalry effective weapons. Hammers and horse slayers can both pose serious threats to a Great Knight's existence. Small detail, they do not take extra bonus damage from weapons that are effective against both, like rapiers, because weapon effectiveness is a binary flag in Fire Emblem. That would be interesting though. Despite being a fairly well-established class across multiple games, only 4 units in the entire franchise join as Great Knights: Dwessel in FE8, Frederick in Awakening, Gunther in Fates, and Bunei in Engage. This is due in part to being a promoted class, and in part to its status as a mid-grade between General and Paladin. While other units can reclass into Great Knight or promote into one, these are the only 4 units that start in this class. Of these units, Dwessel is a mid-game powerhouse who is very difficult to get killed, Friedrich is Awakening's Jagan and thus one of the few effectively mandatory units for Lunatic, Fates' Gunther depends on your route but is generally weaker in stats and is used primarily as a stat backpack or pair-up bot, particularly for Corrin with Forceful Partner, and Bunei joins during the Solm arc amid much better units and is generally considered mediocre at best, with few standout traits, making him bland and forgettable even among the generally samey cast of Engage. 4 extremely different units representing this class, making it very difficult to give a single summary of how the class is used by the developers, at least in the player's hands. Enemy Great Knights generally show up as a way to mix up enemy cavalry positions, sporting significantly higher physical defense with notably lower resistance compared to paladins or bow knights, and usually lower speed than either, but otherwise statted fairly similarly. The goal of using Great Knights in enemy formations is to encourage the player to use mages to take them out, particularly in games like Engage, where on harder difficulties the defense difference between them and paladins can be around 20 points. Back on the player side, it's tempting to see Great Knights as extreme generalists, a halfway point between the defense-focused general and the mobility-focused well-rounded paladin with whom they share a promotion branch, with stats very similar to a Wyvern Knight and movement either equal to or slightly better than promoted infantry depending on the game. And that makes them sound like pretty good units. After all, we praised Wyvern Knights for their incredible stats and being very powerful generalists. Great Knights have basically the same stat block, just trading some mobility for some better defense. However, full flying movement is far better than a few points of defense, and generally, the 1 or 2 points of movement that paladins have matter more than the extra points of defense or slightly higher stat caps given to the Great Knight. And when compared to generals, Great Knights feel awkward. More mobility, usually greater weapon diversity, but the drawbacks of cavalry weakness actually start to matter when you put them on a unit whose goal is to sit and tank an entire enemy squad. 3 Houses Great Knights can't use gauntlets while mounted, for instance, a tool Fortress Knights could sometimes employ for damage. Engage gives them the cavalry unit type, meaning they lose the breakproof armor status that made Engage armors so tempting to begin with. One of the more interesting uses for the Great Knight class is as a slight nerf to the traditional Paladin Jagan. 1 or 2 less points of movement, and an armor-effective vulnerability give the player a reason to train other paladins in the long term, and critical enemies to be cautious of in the short term. Like it or hate it, everyone who's played Awakening knows how the Chapter 1 Hammer Risen can completely ruin your day in a situation where Frederick otherwise is the only safe option. If he were a paladin with the same stats, that enemy wouldn't provide any threat to him at all, and making it a poleaxe fighter instead would add extra threat to Sully, who might not be able to survive anyway on Lunatic, but on lower difficulties would still face getting one-shot. Ultimately, that's the luxury that Great Knight's weaknesses provide a designer, not locking yourself into a single effective weapon track to watch out for. I know some people dislike effective weapon enemies being used as a Jagan counter, but ultimately they're just another tool in the Fire Emblem toolbox, useful for creating texture to an experience, and should at least be considered when crafting a map. So, what's the verdict on Great Knights? Ultimately, they're in an awkward spot. Great Knights lack the high mobility of paladins, or the dedicated defense capabilities of generals. They take some of the downsides of both classes without capitalizing on either's best upsides. Using the class design side as a targeted nerf for Jagans on mobility and effective damage alone is a viable strategy if you're a designer wanting to create threats that can kill a Jagan but leave other units relatively unhindered. That said, they do still have a very solid stat block, and weapon versatility can help them utilize all of your best weapons while avoiding some bad matchups. A Great Knight can then be considered a good filler unit, capable of meeting any basic role with passable expectations, while never outclassing a dedicated specialist in any of those roles. Some might consider the Great Knight the ultimate generalist in this way. This week we explore the Cavalier, the most well-rounded and flexible base class in Fire Emblem, and see why it works so well. The Cavalier's stat line is average across the board, with no stat particularly high or low by default, leaving any major variation to the individual unit's personal stats. Fighters are stronger and have more HP, Myrmidons are faster and more skilled, armors have more defense, and Pegasi and mages have more resistance than Cavaliers. That said, the Cavalier stats give a perfect lesson on the importance of benchmarks. With their decent speed, they double many other foes and only get doubled by Myrmidons and sometimes mercenaries. With their decent strength, they still deal good enough damage to everything except for armors. With their decent skill, they generally don't struggle to hit in the same way fighters do. So while they aren't the best in any field, they're good enough in every field to do all but the most specialized of tasks. On top of having stats that are just good enough most of the time, the Cavalier has 3 advantages over other base classes: their weapons, their movement, and their mount. For weapons, Cavaliers are the only base class in most Fire Emblem games that can use 2 weapon types, traditionally swords and lances. Pretty much every other base class gets limited to a single weapon type the vast majority of the time. This doubles down on their trademark flexibility, letting them pick a better weapon for their assigned job to make up for any weaknesses they have. A more accurate sword for better hit and avoid, a more powerful lance for higher damage, a javelin for 1 to 2 range. Cavaliers have all of these options in a base class. the early game also tends to be when the weapon triangle matters the most, so always being able to get a fairly significant hit, avoid, and damage advantage, or at least never suffer a penalty, makes all of their matchups better. Their movement is the second and often more discussed advantage above other base classes. As discussed in the Armor Knight video, mobility is great for its raw movement, but arguably even more important for the flexibility of placement that mobility provides. If a 6-move unit and a 4-move unit were in the exact same place and wanted to attack an enemy 4 tiles away, the 4-move unit can attack it from 1 or 2 tiles depending on orientation, while the 6-move unit can attack from 3 or 4 tiles, and that's just including melee range. And in a situation where you have several units trying to attack a small group of enemies, particularly in the early game where you can't reliably one round, having units that can move farther lets more of your army attack in the same turn. Yet another example of Cavaliers providing flexibility. This is all without saying how raw mobility lets a unit travel farther to reach more distant objectives faster without using tools like Warp or Dance, which, even in games where they do exist, are generally not available in the early game. Need to rescue a village, chase down a thief, kill a retreating enemy, rush to block a fort, hold a forward choke for a turn, or snipe a key target? Mobility is your best friend at letting you get to any of these locations in a timely manner. The final benefit Cavaliers have over other base classes is their mount. This one is more of a mixed bag, as being on a horse gives them worse movement penalties than other units on rough terrain, and makes them vulnerable to cavalry effective damage, but mounts, at least in some Fire Emblem games, can provide 2 significant advantages: Canto and generally better aid calculation. Aid is only applicable in games with rescue, and tends to be on the more complicated side, but to put it briefly, mounted units can usually rescue units with a much higher constitution than unmounted units can with the same constitution. Exceptions do exist, but this is the general trend. And speaking of rescue, Canto lets mounted units use the rest of their movement after taking certain actions. While moving after attacking is limited to the Jogdral and Tellius games, moving after trading, rescuing, dropping, shopping, or the like exists in the GBA games as well. This means that even if they aren't seeing combat directly, mounted Cavaliers can still benefit your army by ferrying other units around, trading weapons, shopping, and doing all of those non-combat tasks that an army needs to fight at peak efficiency. If there is one word that I've come back to again and again in this video, it is flexibility. If nothing else, even if other units are stronger, faster, bulkier, or have more specific niche use cases, the standard Cavalier has been largely unchanged from the beginning because versatility and flexibility will always be important. Can this framework still create bad units? Well, at the very least it can create underwhelming ones. Alec and Noash in Genealogy of the Holy War often struggle because their combat is poor, and without trading and rescuing, their non-combat utility is almost non-existent. That said, they still often get rated above units with on-paper better combat in tier lists because their high mobility lets them at least participate in combat more than many of their infantry peers. Mystery of the Emblem and Thracia 776 tried a different tactic and forced mounted units to dismount, limiting them to swords and reducing their mobility and stats to be below that of dedicated infantry. This meant that mounted units were better outside, but infantry were preferable indoors, as every advantage the Cavalier would have had was taken away inside. They were still usable, and if sufficiently leveled were still better than untrained infantry, but it was a rather harsh punishment. You can also do what Radiant Dawn did, and double down on movement penalties to literally stop cavalry in their tracks. Horses can't jump up and down ledges, can't move through swamps, and have -2 movement on most indoor maps because, while they didn't want to create a dismounted class type, they did still want to imply that horses can't come indoors. Even with the ability to move after attacking, Cavaliers were so limited by the map design that they rarely got a chance to show all they could do. So, what's the bottom line on Cavaliers? Flexibility. Unless your Cavaliers are far weaker in combat, or severely limited by map design, or every enemy uses a Horse Slayer, the raw flexibility of the Cavalier class, on account of its solid stat block, high mobility, and notable dual weapon access on a base class, make them always reasonable units to deploy. This week we're tackling the tough topic of Trainees and Villagers, what roles these upstart nobodies play in Fire Emblem, and walking the line of both sides of the Magic Cart problem. Villagers and Trainees are technically different, but realistically very similar. They're units you get, usually within the first few maps, which start comically weak even compared to your other low-level units, often because they are part of a Tier 0 class, one step below base classes. All of their base stats are bad, but their potential is their primary asset. There are three main types of trainees: investment multipliers, versatile filler, and mediocre lottery, and it can be hard to differentiate them by looking at the unit alone. It's only in context of the rest of the game, its systems, its other units, and its difficulty level that you can tell what type of trainee a particular unit is. Investment multipliers are units whose late game potential eclipses that of other units, and whose only downside is the difficulty in getting them to the break-even point, where their low base stats are no longer a significant detriment. Awakening's Donnell is the prime example of this type of trainee, being so weak to necessitate deliberate feeding on effectively incapacitated enemies upon joining, and taking basically until reclassing for his stats to catch up, but once he starts snowballing, he can turn into an absolute machine on raw stats alone thanks to the 20% growth boost in all stats from aptitude. His class options are limited, so he doesn't really have versatility, which means the only payoff he gives is the power within his class. The difficulty of getting to the breaking point is often more extreme for investment multipliers, and on higher difficulties it can be seen as unreasonable to even hit that breaking point, leaving the unit in a bad place and low community rating. That said, on lower difficulties the burden of investment is significantly lighter, meaning they can hit the point of snowballing effectiveness far easier and far earlier. This is part of a phenomenon I call the Magikarp problem. It can be difficult, or sometimes just boring, to drag along a useless lump, deliberately hampering your own army to train them up, so the difficulty for doing so needs to feel rewarded in the power jump of the payoff. You don't want it to be too powerful, rendering any other investment obsolete and making the game boring in the opposite direction, but you do need it to feel powerful enough to be worth the effort, otherwise people will question the entire purpose of the painful leveling process. Units like Wendy, Meg, or Amelia often have painful early leveling journeys without any true payoff above what other units are capable of, leaving players feeling like their investment is never truly worth it outside of personal preference, challenge runs, or memes. One way of sidestepping the Magikarp problem is focusing on versatility, allowing a trainee far more options in what they can do compared to other units, even if their effectiveness is not significantly better than more specialized units. Jean from Engage and the Gaiden Villagers fit this bill, focusing less on giving you more bang for your buck, and more on filling whatever gaps your army may have well enough. These units all have paths that might be more ideal for them, but their relative flexibility is your reward for training them, having a unit who is good enough at whatever role you choose to put them in, rather than having a unit who's locked into one role. To some extent, the students in Three Houses all fit this bill. While the staff are specialized into their particular roles, the students all begin as mostly blank slates outside of their personal aptitudes and weaknesses. Even the other students in other houses will slowly solidify themselves down a particular path, which means that the earlier you recruit them, the more relative flexibility they have. Versatile trainees can still suffer from the Magikarp problem, though. If their start is still painful, it will feel bad if they can't fill at least a somewhat unique role that other units can't, like Ross's water walking as pirate, or Ewan's summoner access after shaman. If raw power isn't a trainee's payoff, then having their versatility not feel unique enough will still make them feel like a wasted investment for many players. This comes to the final version of the trainee, the mediocre lottery. These units do not get better levels than other units, and don't have unique versatility. Instead, they simply gain more levels, either by leveling faster via bonuses like Paragon, or getting more levels to grow by being in a Tier 0 class. The strength of these units is broadly determined by the RNG of their level ups. If you have 10 effectively free levels to grow, but don't get many useful stats, you've effectively wasted all that time and effort to create a unit who's no better than a regular base class unit. However, if you get a lot of useful stats in those levels, you're set up to have a unit that's far stronger than their peers for far less relative investment. This type of unit only really works with random growths involved, as when taking average growths or fixed growths into consideration, they tend to lose everything that makes them potentially special or unique. Ross, Amelia, and Ewan from FE8 find themselves in this category, as do units like FE9 Astrid or FE5 Carrion. Trainee units are difficult to balance for, especially because they hit directly upon a divide in player personality. Some players love seeing weak units grow, and will go out of their way to level a weak trainee even if they have very little payoff. Some players despise trying to train weaker units, and will never touch a trainee even if they have incredible long-term payoff. You can't design a trainee to appeal to everyone, purely because of the aforementioned Magikarp problem. Make their training arc too easy, and they cease to be a trainee. Make their training arc too hard, and it won't even matter what the payoff is, people aren't going to do it. Make their payoff too weak, and the training arc will feel incredibly unproportional. Make their payoff too strong, and the entire late game challenge curve gets flattened. Adjust the game to account for that high payoff, and you've successfully created a game where the only viable units are the most long-term powerful ones, risking potential soft locks if a player loses or decides not to train a particular trainee. It is a tightrope that needs to be very carefully walked if one is to create fun, engaging, powerful, and balanced trainees. This week we're taking a heavy swing at the third corner of the weapon triangle and tackling fighters, brigands, and pirates of all stripes, how they texturize the early game, and the way they transition into the mid and late game. Fighters are known for having high hit points and doing big damage with every unreliable hit. High strength and low skill are often involved, but sometimes it's just the high base damage and low base accuracy of axes that inform upon the fighter. Indeed, the axe fighter's stat line doubles down upon the features of their chosen weapon, much like a Myrmidon's speed or skill, or a knight's balance of strength and skill, reinforce the sword and lance corners of the weapon triangle respectively. Speed is usually higher for pirates and brigands than it is for fighters, who often have the slightly higher defense instead, but these differences do vary between games. The larger difference is terrain accessibility, with pirates able to walk slowly on sea and ocean tiles, and brigands able to march through peaks. Water walking is often more useful for taking shortcuts across maps or getting to otherwise inaccessible areas, while cliff walking provides some of the strongest defensive terrain in most games that it appears in. Ultimately, both of these abilities depend on the map to be useful, as locations such as the landlocked interiors of caves or buildings will generally have no terrain to take advantage of. But maps that do have these features can provide a very large advantage for units that are able to make use of them. It's nowhere near as free travel as flying, but it is still more niche mobility than most other unit types. Fighters in the early game suffer from low accuracy and defense, which are compounded by the weapon triangle disadvantage, making them prime targets for sword lords or early Myrmidons or even thieves to take down with little danger. Allied axe fighters are often unreliable at this stage, being capable of big hits on even bulky enemies like armor knights, in ways that only our early pre-promote might be able to mirror, but with a level of inconsistency that makes every single point of accuracy lost to terrain feel even more impactful. This inconsistent early game can mirror itself in the late game Gambler Berserker type unit, like Garrett, with a higher crit chance than a hit chance, leading to situations where you either completely destroy your target or leave them entirely unscathed. The relative inconsistency but high power on hit creates a three-way branching path for axe fighters going into the midgame, all of which can be seen in their original showing of FE1. Many axe fighters will simply fail to get enough level ups to keep up, often because they fail to get kills because of their inaccuracy, or because players deliberately avoid using them, and will get left behind. Even if not intentionally designed this way, games which give multiple axe fighters all at once often have at least some who suffer this fate. FE1's Daros, with his abysmal growths despite his unique water walking, usually follows this path. This intentional disposability of axe fighters might also explain everyone's favorite weapon, the Devil Axe. Doubling down on big early hits and the relative expendability of fighters, the Devil Axe creates a niche for axe fighters by being a weapon that players would feel less willing to use if they could on a more long-term growth unit like a Cavalier or a Mercenary. The second path that axe fighters can take is that they serve a solely transitory role in your army, having a use in the early game for damage and bulk, but often failing to keep up even when leveled. Having weapon ranks that let them use effective weaponry like hammers or halberds can be especially potent in the early game, but often lose their value later on as better weapons and more units capable of using said weapons become available. FE1 specifically designed transitive axe fighters into the game, where axes are not sold in shops after the first third of the game, thus putting an effective limit on how much you can use any axe unit unless you stock up ahead of time. These axe fighters will find use early on, and maybe into the mid-game, but will likely not have priority on promotion items or stat boosters, and will eventually fall out of deployment. Board and Cord suit this role very nicely, with some rare one-rounding potential in their join chapter, and the use of hammer for armors, but lacking late-game potential to really keep going. For another example, Engage's Boucheron also fits this role through the use of the game's unit type system, as he is the only backup unit in your army until either getting Anna or Lapis, and chain attacks are always valuable, even if they don't lead to long-term use of the unit performing them. The third likely avenue for axe fighters is that they will just be very good. This might depend on some lucky growths early on, but with modern Fire Emblem limiting the severity of weight and accuracy penalties for axes, and especially for any fighters that get personal weapons, many axe fighters have solid potential, and will only need a bit of help early on to push them there. While their mobility or versatility might be lacking compared to cavalry or flyers, a good long-term axe fighter will have strong hits and decent bulk that last all game long, with a sense of reliability that lesser axe fighters may lack. Despite having limited weapons and no promotion in FE1, Barst manages to find himself as a pretty solid and reliable unit on raw stats and determination alone, and this only gets better in later remakes. Axe fighters will rarely be the absolute best units in your army, at least for more than a few early chapters, but if they are, it is almost certainly through a combination of player and developer favoritism. Bottom line, 1. Embrace the inconsistency. If you're going to have an axe fighter have low accuracy, bump up their damage to compensate. If you have a high risk, high reward mechanic, putting it on an axe fighter makes a lot of sense. 2. Reliability is boring but effective. A reliable axe fighter can be a pillar of your early army before your growth units come online, and might even be a good growth target themselves. 3. Accept their nature as temporary units. Most players will use an early axe unit only because there are no better options. This is not inherently a problem, and can in fact be used as a teaching moment for what a player should value, such as Board using effective weaponry, or Boucheron's backup unit status. This week it's finally time to talk about Lords, the main character, the only required deployment, and the pros and cons of various ways to design them. We will not be talking about royals or side character lords as found in Fates or Engage. This is strictly speaking about the lone or duo main character. What makes up a lord is actually harder to make one single case for than most other unit types. Instead, lords are spread across a continuum, with a number of factors to consider, including relative strength, weapon type, and promotion. The only true global factor about all lords in Fire Emblem is that they are a mandatory survival condition. If there is no lord, there is no game. Unless you flag other units for mandatory survival like Robin or Chris, the main lord is the only unit the designer can guarantee the player has access to, though any factors about the unit such as training, inventory, or class in a reclassing game are not guaranteed by the developer. This is why it is common to see a final act power-up, with the main lord getting a personal weapon that is very strong against the final boss, sometimes with a powerful promotion or a dedicated training map, to try to ensure that the player has not soft-locked themselves. This is one of the few control valves the developer has in an open-ended game like Fire Emblem. This is the mechanical reasoning as to why, for example, Fire Emblem 1 Marth gets Mercurius and why the Falchion makes him immune to physical weapons, why FE2 Alm gets force promoted and goes through the gauntlet to get his Falchion, or why FE6 Roy gets a promotion and the Binding Blade at the same time, making him strong enough from base to fight endgame enemies. Use that guaranteed deployment to your advantage to make sure that, at least on easier difficulties or single difficulty games, your players can finish the game no matter how their party looks if they get that far. When combined with the late game safety units like Goto or Athos, an endgame power-up guarantees that a player who has invested the time to get to the endgame can finish the game. Promoting based on the story can also be a point of contention, however. It might make sense mechanically for a main lord to be powered up for the final fight, but this also means that they often get passed up by the rest of the army for a significant portion of the game, as everyone else gets to promote and gets their peak performance, while the main lord ends up falling so far behind that their required deployment is seen as more of a liability than an asset. Looking back to the early game, one of the other common factors among lords is that they will have some form of rapier, an early game personal weapon effective against both cavalry and armor units. These are two unit types that are commonly bosses in the early game, and will generally be among the more threatening or annoying enemy types to deal with throughout the early and mid-game. Rapiers also often feature higher hit and crit rates than equivalent strength weapons, encouraging the player to use them as a consistent and powerful option even against foes that they don't deal effective damage against. Games that break this rule either have no rapier equivalent at all, because the lord doesn't particularly need that power, have a personal weapon other than a rapier that's better against the game's particular threats, or make the rapier something that anyone can use, removing the reliance upon a single unit for combat. Players familiar with the Fire Emblem series will likely have a few assumptions for how lords will play and grow, usually gaining high skill and luck with decent speed, but less consistent strength or defense. Any changes to this dynamic are often flagged by a larger change to the unit, to force players out of that headspace. Main weapon type is an easy way to tell the player this unit probably won't work like other lords you're used to. Path of Radiance Ike, Shadow Dragon Marth, Awakening Crom, Fire Emblem 7 Eliwood, and FE6 Roy all play differently within their game's contexts, but are talked about far similarly compared to Hector, Ephraim, and Micaiah, whose gameplay differences are far more notable because of their different weapon choices. The traditional Sword Lord has often been criticized as weak, inflexible, or not worth training. This is globally untrue, as sometimes Sword Lords can be among the strongest units in their respective games, but it is a pervasive and convincing narrative among people who have played several games wherein this feels more true. This is less of an issue of the Lord's actual stats or advantages in a vacuum, and more often in relation to the other units alongside them. It's easy to criticize Eliwood's performance when he's sharing the field with both box-ready Marcus and more viable training products like Lowen, especially when they can promote far earlier and gain access to more weapons, higher stats, better stat caps, and more, while he's stuck for the majority of the game at 5 move and a level and stat cap of 20. Late promotion means less in games where stat caps are not meaningfully raised by promotion. Lords like Marth and Leaf feel less like wasted EXP to train compared to lords like Roy or Eliwood because their combat prowess is not capped halfway relative to their peers. Galzus might have near-cap stats, sure, but nothing is mechanically preventing Leaf from approaching or matching his performance because of a 20-point stat cap. Meanwhile, Eliwood will continue to fall farther and farther behind Lowen after he promotes, with Eliwood's late promotion leaving him with unpromoted caps that cannot be exceeded even with every available stat booster. This is not to say that a Lord needs to be the strongest unit in your army to be worth using. There is a real danger in making the Lord so powerful that every other unit is effectively pointless, as both player and designer likely will want a good number of the cast to see active use. Instead, having the Lord serve a unique role, such as Micaiah's healing and magical damage, or Celica's access to monster-effective Seraphim magic, can ensure their use in combat without completely overshadowing the rest of your army. There are also valid non-combat roles that Lords can play well, particularly because of their forced deployment. The large number of units Leaf supports allows him to strengthen other units just by being around them, more so when given charm through something like the Kingmaker Sword. Alir's personal skill grants true damage and flat damage reduction to adjacent allies, which can be increased through some bond or emblem ring abilities, and Alir's Engage Plus ability rewards both their own combat as well as using them to boost other units. Whichever direction your main lord points, make sure it complements the design of your game. If you want a traditional linear narrative with late game power-up, consider the tools your main lord is given to help the player succeed through using them. If you want a more open-ended play experience, try to design a main lord that can either lead or support whatever composition the player ends up with. Always be aware of the lord's relative power to other units, particularly in the mid-game, if you want a story-based promotion or power-up. And don't be afraid to give the lord something unique that will encourage the player to use them, while also not overshadowing the other units in your game. This week, we're taking a look at Thieves, the oddball combat utility unit who has steadily lost utility and gained combat prowess over time, and how to find their niche. The Thief class has existed in some form or another in every Fire Emblem game except for Gaiden and SOV, but their specifics have changed with every appearance. Stat-wise, most Thieves feature very high speed and skill, with middling to low stats in most other areas. They avoid and evade more than taking hits, and while they can land hits themselves, they won't generally be doing much damage. One interesting way this relative weakness to other combat units has been explored was in the very first Fire Emblem game, where both Thieves had a 0% growth in the weapon level stat. This meant that, even with the only weapon manual in the game, Thieves were never able to wield Levin swords or Silver swords, meaning that even in a game with global 20 caps, Thieves were always going to be limited in their combat strength. The unique factor of Thieves that differentiates them from every other unit is their utility. In most games, Thieves have the ability to open doors and chests that other units can't. This may require a lockpick item, or maybe a passive ability like Lock Touch. In some games, certain bridges can also be opened by Thieves as well. This encourages deploying Thieves in maps with many locked items. Key items can be used instead to supplement or replace this form of utility, in case the player doesn't have a Thief, chooses not to deploy them, or sends them a different way and doesn't want to wait for them. Key items may not always be available though, or may be very limited in uses, requiring players to either use a Thief, or choose not to open some doors or collect some treasures. Some games allow Thieves to steal items, often only if they are faster than their target. Some games restrict this thievery to only non-weapon items, while others allow taking weapons from enemies, though often with restrictions based on weapon weight, equipped status, or other restrictions. Stealing items is usually an irreplaceable aspect of utility for thieves, so consideration must be made to make these stealable items both useful enough to encourage a thief deployment, but not mandatory in case a player loses or does not train or deploy a thief. Common high-value stealables include stat boosters, promotion items, gems, or healing items. An often overlooked aspect of thief utility is their extra vision range in Fog of War maps. Being able to see multiple tiles farther into Fog of War than other units gives thieves exponentially more tiles that they can see at once compared to other units. This can often be combined with a torch item to extend that vision range even farther. In games with particularly restrictive Fog of War, like Engage, gaining such a massive vision advantage translates to far better movement flexibility, and cuts down on the restrictive or surprising elements that Fog of War can introduce. Again though, this is not irreplaceable utility, as players can always play Fog of War maps just with any unit, but it does assist your army overall in a unique way that would otherwise require special items, assuming that they were available at all. Thieves can also provide game-specific utility. Fire Emblem 4's unit-specific money system was augmented by thieves, who stole money that their target was holding if they hit, and could then give that money out to any other unit. While again, not mandatory, good use of a thief allowed a player to gear out other characters faster and more effectively than they otherwise could, especially when expensive items like rings were involved. Some games allowed thieves to promote, giving them access to the Silencer, Lethality, or Bane skills. This gave them an odd form of combat utility, letting them randomly kill, or severely weaken in Bane's case, some units that they fight, regardless of stats. So even if their general combat was poor, they could still occasionally be used to take out a particularly dangerous foe, assuming the player was lucky enough. This gets ruined when higher priority targets are made immune to these effects, but I may talk about this later if I ever cover forcing developer intent over top of player ingenuity. But this does lead us into the world of modern Fire Emblem, where thief, non-combat utility is being steadily removed and replaced with experimental forms of combat utility. Whereas GBA and earlier Thieves used swords, making them often just weaker Myrmidons, the knife and dagger type weapons were introduced in Path of Radiance, and while they were frankly terrible there, Radiant Dawn made knives 1-2 range, with daggers being 1 range with higher damage and often high crit. Still nothing special compared to Fates, whose knives and shurikens were 1-2 range without universal restrictions like javelins or hand axes in that game, while also providing debuffs to the target's stats. Ninjas, the de facto thief replacement for Hoshido, became incredibly threatening and annoying units, designed in theory to weaken enemies and set up kills for others, especially with skills like Poison Strike, but in practice just being strong and fast enough to kill on their own. Outlaws, Nor's thief replacement, instead merged the thief's speed and lock-touch utility with the archer class, providing a particular combat specialty niche against flyers and, thanks to the weapon triangle, ninjas, whilst keeping the fast, skillful, lockpicking utility players have come to know. The advancement of knives did skip 3 houses, which focused instead on thief mobility by giving that class line the stealth, pass, lethality, and ability to ignore terrain penalties skills. Decent, but without truly helpful utility, the class got overshadowed by other classes that did the mobility or combat better. Engage is currently the most recent game in the series, and it removed all lock-touch utility from the game, leaving thieves with only their greater Fog of War vision. The covert unit type included thieves and archers, and doubled evasion bonuses from terrain. Daggers in Engage inflicted poison, a stacking debuff that caused all future attacks against the target to deal bonus damage. This made the role of thieves evasive chip damage units who set up kills on stronger opponents for other units. A far cry from their previous iterations, sure, but without non-combat utility, there are only so many ways you can create a unique role for such a unit. Thieves truly rely on their utility to stand out. While some games have attempted to carve out a new niche for thieves that directly involves combat, having a unit whose core design is to set up kills for others will almost always backfire, either because the experience system of Fire Emblem will cause that unit to fall farther and farther behind the level curve, or because making them strong enough to not care about falling behind will end up making them just take the kills themselves, creating just another death machine unit, only this time dodgy instead of bulky. Non-combat utility is only as good as the map design lets it be, though. If the maps have multiple side objectives that are high value, then players will naturally want to deploy thieves to obtain them, although the amount of awareness that players need to find and keep track of things like stealable stat boosters is a skill the designers will likely need to train into the player. If maps have few valuable side objectives, or if they can all be obtained without Thieves, either by unit capture or buyable keys or the like, then many players will see Thieves as wasted deployment slots, and choose instead to use a stronger combat unit, or a unit whose utility matches their needs more. Ultimately, if you can't design maps with enough opportunities for a utility unit like a Thief, then instead, making a different flavor of combat unit is still a viable option, though they are then competing more directly with other units and lose much of what makes a dedicated utility unit interesting to deploy. This week we're discussing the original flying unit, the Pegasus Knight, and whether they stand out from, match, or suffer in the shadow of the Wyvern Knight. Pegasus Knights have existed in every Fire Emblem game and have managed to maintain a very similar stat block most of the time. With notably high speed and resistance, but generally lower strength and defense, Pegasus Knights tend to match up well against mages and decently against Myrmidons in a straight-up fight, but often struggle to deal with armor knights or axe fighters and are generally slightly weaker than Cavaliers. Often joining in the early game with fairly subpar base stats compared to your other units, even at such an early chapter, the first Pegasus Knight in your army is meant to teach you the power of flight, reaching objectives that other units can't, hiding in safe spots over mountains or oceans between sniping kills, or, in games with rescue and pair-up, shuttling slower units to important locations, are all incredibly valuable tactical moves that flight opens up. Training Pegasus Knights for combat, then, involves managing how many turns of utility you're giving up for turns spent attacking and in danger. Early training is important, however. As with their fairly low base stats, most early game Pegasus Knights will quickly become too weak to deal meaningful damage and too fragile to survive a round of combat against a normal enemy without some dedicated training and good level ups. Shadow Dragon Sita, with her forgeable rapier effect Wing Spear, is the biggest exception to this rule, but pretty much every other game that gives you an early Pegasus Knight tends to make them weaker than most of the other units you have at base. Even Pegasus Knights that are considered viable carry units, like Sacred Stone's Vanessa, still need several early level ups just to keep up with enemies, let alone the rest of your army. Mid-game Pegasus Knights often have a higher focus on combat, with generally better growth rates than their early joining sisters, but base stats that still reinforce their fragility in direct combat. This means training them for combat is still effortful, but will tend to be more reliable in creating a combat-focused flyer over time than training most early-game Pegasus Knights. Late-game Pegasus Knights come in two flavors, Est and Juno. Est flyers tend to join with similar stats to their mid-game counterparts, but several chapters later, often with either higher growth rates or some other unique attribute to help them stand out. Juno flyers are pre-promotes, who join with fairly mediocre base stats for their point in the game, who are mostly there to provide additional flying utility or just to fill out a triangle attack, whilst having combat utility similar to the mid-game flyer had at their join time at base. In other words, it's technically workable, but they won't be strong enough to survive much on their own. With all of the broad types of Pegasus Knights covered, let's zoom in a bit on their matchups versus mages, the looming threat of archers, and then compare them to the frontline flying tanks, Wyvern Riders. Mage matchup in particular is a notable strength of Pegasus Knights for several reasons. Their high resistance is an obvious part, taking less damage on average than almost every unit type except for Clerics. A Pegasus Knight with decent resistance can fly into a field of mages and probably survive better than anyone else, even with their lower HP pool. Speed is the other benefit the Pegasus Knights have over other units. Mages aren't incredibly fast, but they generally aren't slow either, so a unit with above average speed can consistently double them. This is important because a Pegasus Knight's low strength means that they rely on doubling in order to deal efficient damage. Luckily, the mage's low defense means that even with their lower strength, a Pegasus Knight can still deal significant damage, often one-rounding mages at close to base stats, despite failing to one-round most other unit types. A safe, effective matchup, and one of the closest things to a hard counter matchup that traditional Fire Emblem has. Speaking of hard counters, however, the flyer is at the receiving end of one, and that is against archers. Bows, ballistae, and especially Tellius crossbows all have the potential to completely erase Pegasus Knights from existence. Before effective damage negation comes into play through Delphi Iota Philly shields, the Pegasus Knight is the recipient of the most common effective damage type in the game. No other class is universally vulnerable to an entire class of weapons in every single Fire Emblem game. Hammers and Horseslayers can be threatening to Knights and Cavaliers, sure, but not every enemy fighter or soldier is holding one. The effective damage that bows have, combined with the low physical defense of Pegasus Knights, means that every archer or ballista's attack range needs to be considered an instant death range for Pegasus Knights, zoning out their flyer utility and severely hindering their combat potential. This can be used by clever designers to create a web of danger with carefully placed safe spots, most notably in ballista maps, to still allow Pegasus Knights some utility while limiting their freedom until the ballistas are taken out. Many maps with ballistas overlap their ranges, however, such that Pegasus Knights are almost entirely unusable. But if Pegasus Knights have such a hard time with archers, don't Wyvern Riders suffer the same fate? In some ways, yes, their arrow weakness in most games makes Wyvern Riders just as vulnerable to archers and ballista as Pegasi. However, their significantly higher defense and HP stats often allow Wyverns to survive a hit or two that would completely drop a Pegasus. While not as speedy and having poor resistance stat on average, the average Wyvern's high defense, strength, and hit points make it far more durable, like an Armor Knight with flying mobility. The Pegasus' hardest matchups then become survivable at worst and actually favored at best for a Wyvern, and the only matchups Pegasi have over Wyverns, mages, become similar to how mages work against every other unit type. Hit them first or you'll get hit hard back. This is why the typical Pegasus Knight will take a lot more training and effort to reach the combat prowess of your average Wyvern Knight. The utility of the Pegasus Knight is sometimes superior to the Wyvern's utility. In the GBA games, for instance, the odd reversed aid calculation for mounted units means that Pegasus Knights, with their lower constitution on average, can carry much heavier units than Wyvern Knights with their higher average constitution can. Some later Pegasus Knights also have staff access, or get it on promotion to Falcon Knight, providing them with additional non-combat utility to make up for their frontline combat deficits when compared to Wyverns. But what if you wanted to emphasize the unique combat matchup potential of a Pegasus Knight? This is where Gaiden, and to a lesser extent Shadows of Valentia, shine. Promoted Falcon Knights get the Slayer skill, providing plus 10 damage versus monsters in SOV, and setting their attack regardless of weapon to its max of 40 versus monsters in Gaiden. This is a heavy-handed and over-the-top method of forcing combat utility into a class, but given the difficult training arc of an unpromoted Pegasus Knight, and the relative lack of utility in many maps of the game, giving the Falcon Knight this incredibly strong ability was an interesting way to set it apart and make training them to promotion worthwhile. So, to sum it all up, Pegasus Knights are built to be fragile at base, emphasizing utility more than direct combat capabilities, at least before serious training investment. Pegasi are built to directly counter mages at the cost of poorer matchups against most high defense or high strength units. Archers completely zone out Pegasi as the hardest counter in all of Fire Emblem. If you are designing maps, be very conscious of where your archers can shoot to deter or encourage certain Pegasi flight paths. Compared to Pegasi, the massive amount of physical bulk and strength that Wyverns have is almost always superior to the Pegasi's speed and resistance, though Pegasi often have superior utility and better unique matchups, such as versus mages. This week we are discussing dedicated staff wielders of all stripes, clerics and troubadours alike, and why some are indispensable while others are indefensible. Clerics have a mix of stats across individual units, but there's one thing that the vast majority have, and it's resistance. Usually physically frail and incapable of attacking in combat, if an unpromoted cleric is being used intentionally for combat, it is to block enemy mages or draw enemy siege tome fire. Troubadours often have slightly lower resistance and similarly fluctuant other stats per unit, but their mount provides better basic movement and additional utility in games with rescue or pair-up. Obviously, this is not the primary role of the unit. A staffer should be using their staves. The most basic and widely available staves are Heal and Mend, letting the cleric use their turn to restore the HP of another unit, with higher magic stat healing more per use. Higher level healing staves either heal more hit points, heal at a distance, or heal multiple units at once. More advanced staves are rarer, offering utility such as temporarily increasing resistance, illuminating Fog of War maps, moving other units, or inflicting powerful debuffs like Sleep or Silence on enemies, or cleansing those debuffs from your allies. This creates a second stat that matters far more than magic or resistance for clerics: weapon level. While it has been changed from the universal stat in FE1 and FE3 to the lettered rank system from FE4 onward, the importance of staff rank cannot be understated. The primary division point between a great staff user and a simple heal bot is their staff rank, full stop. Riss might be the first curate in the series, but it's Lena that gets the credit as being the good staff user, because the only staff Riss can use for a long time is Heal, while Lena can use Warp, Mend, and others from base. Not that heal bots can't be useful. The only ways to heal your units on a map in most Fire Emblem games are either to wait on a healing tile, use a consumable item, activate a unique skill or weapon effect, or be healed with a staff. Since very few units have access to self-healing skills or weapons, and map tiles are often too slow or inconvenient for most healing needs, being able to use a healer is usually the best and often only way to restore a unit's hit points, particularly in the early game, where healing items are rarer or more valuable. Without a way to reliably restore hit points, many maps become far more difficult, particularly on higher difficulties with harder hitting or more accurate enemies. Even in games where healing items are plentiful and powerful, like Radiant Dawn, a dedicated healer can still provide utility. Suppose we think of a dedicated heal bot as a bad dancer. They merely save turns that would otherwise be spent using a vulnerary or an elixir. In a pinch, getting a heal and killing a key target on player phase in the same turn can definitely be valuable, even if, in the long run, it doesn't make that much of a difference. Heal staffs are also much more gold efficient on average when compared to consumable items. A GBA heal staff costs 600 gold and can be used 30 times, for instance, compared to a vulnerary's 300 gold price for only 3 uses. Even if the cleric has 0 magic, so both heal and vulnerary would restore 10 hit points per use, the staff would be 5 times more gold efficient, in addition to being more inventory efficient and providing experience for the cleric. All of this is what a heal bot cleric like Riss can offer. That is the baseline for any cleric. The better clerics can offer far more. Warp, a utility staff that moves another unit several tiles whilst ignoring walls or other restrictions, is considered so powerful and game warping by many in the Fire Emblem community that it is often used in arguments as a single word excuse for bad map design, a fatal flaw preventing good map design, a single item whose effective use separates the self-styled elite of the efficiency bourgeoisie from the playing as intended plebeians, but the existence of a powerful warp staff implies by necessity a cleric capable of wielding it. If you have a powerful enough end goal, then players will naturally find the most efficient course to reach that goal. Finding the unit with the highest and earliest base staff rank is the first step in this endgame warp goal, and thus, early clerics with low ranks will be compared to later joining ones with higher ranks solely on how many turns it is estimated to take to achieve this requisite staff rank. Dedicated clerics, then, must compete with promoted mages and other classes with staff access, in which comparison clerics are often found wanting. Because, to be seen as a good unit in Fire Emblem means that you need to provide more value for a limited deployment slot than another unit. And, while heal bots and utility staffers both provide near-exclusive staff access in the early game, other units that get staff access on promotion negate much of the need for a dedicated staff unit unless there is some height of staff rank or unique personal staff which only the base cleric can achieve. Gaining combat access with what are usually poor weapon ranks is far less special for a cleric, entering into more direct competition with their peers for limited deployment. Then, gaining utility whilst having a good weapon rank and stats, as is often the case with promoting mages into sages. As these units also often compete for the same limited promotion item, the Guiding Ring or Master Seal respectively depending on your game, the direct comparison of which one benefits the army more gets scrutinized more heavily. Is it more effective to train a poor weapon rank on a staffer that you will likely still be using for utility most of the time, and as we have seen from their generally mediocre stats, is unlikely to see much enemy phase combat? Or should you promote an already effective combat unit to provide some extra utility, a second or third healer for the inevitable situation where more than one unit in your army is heavily damaged? Promoting mages on an equal playing field thus wins out for a majority of the time for optimizing players. But the playing field is rarely even. Depending on the game, it can be horribly tilted. Clerics in Fire Emblem 1 and Gaiden did not gain experience for healing, instead being forced to see combat to level up, and in Fire Emblem 1 also had no means of defending themselves at all. Clerics between the SNES and DS era received an amount of experience per staff use solely dependent on the staff that they used, sometimes with a penalty for being promoted, with no accounting for the level of their target. The 3DS games onward have made healing give experience relative to both the staffer and target's levels, so an overleveled staffer would slow their experience gain to a crawl, while an underleveled one might see a small boost over the expected norm. This is notable because staffers, like dancers, generate their own experience regardless of enemies. If there is a staff target, you may use a staff and gain experience. It doesn't matter if the enemies are all dead, it doesn't matter if you spend 50 turns on the same map, a player can take all the time that they want, given the ability to create a staffable situation, like a damage tile or an enemy attack, and farm as much experience and rank as they have staves. This turns the experience gain into a simple equation, where time plus gold equals experience. While you can argue the weapons do this as well for combat units, there is inevitably a limit on the amount of enemies you will face on any given map. And if the game does not provide an infinite source of combat, such as an arena, overworld skirmishes, or the like, then it is rarely gold or time that is limiting your combat units leveling, but targets. Meanwhile, the Staffer has theoretically infinite targets. They are your own units after all, and thus experience can flow as freely as possible. However true this may be in a vacuum, the cost of time is incredibly significant to many players, as the number of people willing to spam end turn and heal on a map with a recurring damage element is often very low. This leads to many players finding that their staff units tend to fall behind in levels quite dramatically, as in a theoretical map that takes 10 turns to beat, even assuming they can use heal every turn with the Cleric will only be able to gain 110 experience at established GBA static rates for the heal staff, while combat units are gaining experience from dealing damage and killing enemies, which offer both more experience per kill and can be dynamically adjusted by the player to funnel experience directly into a smaller subset of deployed units. The result of this is a wildly different community perception of the utility of staff units. Ultimately, however, it is the uniqueness, or lack thereof, of a cleric's utility which most impacts their perceived value over time. While sometimes this takes the form of unique staves, such as Lena or Sappy's access to Hamurn, or Tina's Thief and Unlock staff access, this can also be just a cleric's raw ability to achieve useful staff ranks faster than other units. If the utility of staves is very high compared to the relative utility of combat, such as in Thracia 776, staff access will be considered a premium attribute worth doggedly pursuing. If the utility of staves is low, such as in Radiant Dawn, then staff access will be at worst a nice to have, maybe not worth deploying all the time, but still a decent thing to have access to in a pinch. So when designing clerics in Fire Emblem, consider the following. The longer a player spends on any map, the more experience their clerics will gain relative to their combat units. The best clerics in Fire Emblem have something that they do that is considered irreplaceable, that even other classes with some staff access cannot duplicate. In these instances, staves like Warp are the quickest way for players to break your game, so be careful when designing what unique utility to provide to your clerics. Even if other utility is limited, the ability to heal other units is still always going to be useful somewhere, making staff access a clear benefit, even if a dedicated staff user isn't always desirable. This week, we are examining dancers and refreshing units of all stripes, the absurd power of unit refreshing, and whether a dancer needs any more utility than that. Dancers are usually extremely fragile units with little to no capability of defending themselves. High luck and decent speed and resistance will only go so far on a unit with very poor HP and defense. It is often best if a dancer never sees any combat, and there is usually very little benefit in them doing so. Dancer is a colloquial term for any unit that can use their turn to give another action to an ally. Bards, singers, herons, and the new staff and spell are all included in this definition. One playable dancer has been in every main series Fire Emblem game except for Shadow Dragon, Gaiden, and Mystery of the Emblem Book 1. Some games, including Binding Blade and Radiant Dawn, have multiple units capable of refreshing, but never let you deploy more than one at a time. This is an important restriction, as if you had multiple units capable of refreshing actions as their basic repeatable action, it would easily become possible to have infinite actions, moving across an entire map in a single, never-ending turn. Some games, like Three Houses and Engage, introduce multiple options for refreshing units, but all options outside of a dedicated dancer unit have been limited, either by chapter, emblem charge, or other means. This prevents the situation of an endless dance chain, whilst also allowing the fun of refreshing a unit multiple times in a single turn. Which gets us to why dancers exist. It's fun to use a unit multiple times in one turn. Sometimes one unit is just better than your others for a particular situation, and you just want more of their attacks in ways that a different combat unit just couldn't replicate. Maybe you want to move one unit farther than normally possible on a turn, or attack and retreat in a game without canter. Dancers enable this sort of play as well. In some games, dancers are capable of refreshing multiple units with a single action. This force multiplier requires careful planning and positioning to make the most of, but if a single target refresh is seen as powerful, a quad refresh is often seen as game warping. That said, something like a four-way dance can trigger a player's gut reaction against wastefulness in an unintended way, where they may obsess about refreshing 4 units every time, even if it provides no more benefit, and possibly a positioning detriment, over dancing for only 1 or 2 targets. Going more specific, deploying a dancer with 5 move can allow a paladin or flyer to move up to 6 spaces farther on their first turn than they otherwise could, perfect for time-sensitive objectives such as in Battle Before Dawn. Deploying a dancer, archer, mage, and cleric allows you to have effectively 2 of all 3 types of non-dancer units when needed: 2 archer attacks against a flyer, 2 mage attacks versus armors, 2 staff uses when multiple units need healing, in ways that a single other unit cannot provide. And sure, the best unit in your army might contribute more than any one dancer, but the dancer often is not competing with the best unit for deployment slots. They are competing with the 12th best, or whatever the deployment limit is, and their base level contribution is a double action buff to your best unit on many turns. Of course, this all assumes your dancer is on the front lines, reaching your best units regularly, whilst somehow staying out of harm's way themselves. Sometimes this is easy. A solid defensive line can be formed, and then moved forward with your dancer just a few steps behind. Other times this is harder, with ballistas or siege tomes making entire segments of the battlefield unsafe for such a fragile unit. Or with units so far apart that your dancer can often struggle to reach any useful dance targets after the first few turns. Dancers are thus seen as skill check units for the player, a multiplier of the player's power that requires tactical planning and forethought to use effectively. A bulky wyvern or a general is fairly foolproof. You move them where you want them, and they do their job. It often doesn't matter if they see unexpected combat, because they'll probably survive, unless effective damage is involved. A dancer, on the other hand, needs protection. They need a target to have already moved next to their destination, they need the player to plan ahead in their following turn to make sure the dancer will have a new target that turn, and they need a safe zone to be created so they don't ever see combat. It is a difficult ask for a player to manage, which is why some players see dancers as useless, not fitting into their strategies. Some dancers do have combat abilities, albeit usually quite weak when compared to any other combat unit of roughly equivalent level. As the vast majority of dancers do not benefit much from levels, you don't get to dance better at higher levels and your combat is still not your main focus, the ability to equip weapons and fight should be seen as a last resort, maybe an augmentation of the weapon triangle in the rare instances that they see combat, or a small touch of chip damage to perform if they somehow have no viable dance target. The dancers of the GBA games and the Herons of Tellius have effectively no direct combat capabilities. This focuses them down to solely being refresher units. With the temptation to attack with them removed, they instead become something of a platonic ideal of a dancer, a unit with a single purpose, one single action, yet nearly infinite possibilities through other units. But is there more that a dancer can do? And if so, can it compete with refreshing? Fire Emblem 7 The Blazing Blade introduced rings to give temporary status buffs to units. These increases were significant and powerful, but because of their limited uses and relatively niche applications, Ninian and Nils often saw use primarily as refreshers. Radiant Dawn attempted to give leveling Herons a purpose by having them learn new utility songs, doing things like changing biorhythm or filling Lagoo's gauge. However, since the impact of these things is so much smaller than taking additional actions, once again, refreshing was the default action used, and many players might not even have known that these other songs existed. Shadows of Valencia attempted the reverse of Radiant Dawn, locking the Anu spell deep in Faye's cleric spell list. This served as a very effective draw for players who knew it existed to level Faye as a cleric throughout the game, but because it was locked deep behind a single class-line option on one unit, with nothing in-game making the player aware of its existence, it ended up being, for many players, a fun optimization or goal on a second playthrough, instead of a guaranteed reward for training a utility unit. There is still interesting possibility space for a utility unit to unlock unit refreshing at a later level, reminiscent of staff units gaining warp ranks late into the game, but it's unclear as of right now how that would work, and is a topic better explored on its own. But what have we learned about dancers? A dancer is often only as good as the player's ability to position them. If it's hard to keep them out of harm's way whilst also refreshing units, then their usefulness will be limited to players capable of doing so. Dancers are difficult to design around. Despite being very powerful, the skill required and variability inherent in their usefulness means you can't know with any reliability how players will best use refresher units, if they even use them at all. Dancers really should not see combat. While token combat ability is appreciated by many players, don't hesitate to remove it entirely if it suits the unit better, as this will barely impact the unit's usability in the vast majority of situations. Refreshing multiple units is incredibly powerful. This is an ability that should be carefully considered and planned around, whether that means giving it a use limit or restricting the dancer in other ways, such as having lower mobility. This week we're tackling the tricky subject of hybrid units, the problems with trying to hybridize instead of specialize, and how to make both strength and magic meaningful on the same unit. Hybrid units are units in classes with an innate ability to deal both physical and magical damage. While many games have some one-off magical weapons allowing physical units to strike magically, such as the Levin Sword, one weapon does not a true hybrid unit make. Instead, we look to Gaiden's Priestess class as the first true hybrid class, with other hybrid classes remaining relatively few and far between until Awakening, where classes like Grand Master, Dark Flyer, and Dark Knight allowed a much wider percent of the cast to attempt to fill hybrid roles, and subsequent games have had a more common hybrid presence. One of the big questions guiding the viability of hybrid classes is whether attack stats are split. In games like Gaiden, SOV, and the GBA games, one stat controls both physical and magical damage. This makes the defenses of the target and the stats of the weapon the sole factors determining the effectiveness of one damage type over another. In this setup, hybrid access is nothing but upside. With Gaiden and SOV's magic system, there is some give and take with how enemy phase is handled, but if you have the freedom to pick what type of damage you deal, it lets you exploit the weaker of your foe's defenses with no real penalty. The splitting of attack stats into strength and magic creates a very different sort of situation. If we consider many units as excelling in one stat and neglecting the other, then even if they have access to both combat styles, they will be far more effective with one but not the other. Cordelia might get to use a Fire Tome on promotion to Dark Flyer, but if she has 20 strength and 6 magic, then the enemy's defense needs to be much higher than their resistance for fire to be more effective than a javelin. Similarly, Maribel could also become a Dark Flyer with the inverse of those stats, but that wouldn't make her an effective hybrid. She would be a flying mage that happens to have a lance rank. This does not negate the hybrid class's existence. If anything, it can become an even more desirable class by appealing to units on either side of the aisle. But such steep separation of strength and magic don't feel like they take advantage of the hybrid class's full potential. If a unit is more balanced in both stats but excels in neither, then they will almost always feel weaker than a specialist on either side of the divide. A unit with 15 in both strength and magic will be meaningfully weaker than a fighter with 25 strength and a mage with 25 magic, to the point that they will rarely be dealing meaningful damage against all but the enemies with extremely imbalanced defenses despite their versatility. This falls into a problem where, as hybrid options have increased in number, so too have most enemies' average defenses in both styles. If enemies have a significant gap in one defensive style, then the ability to exploit it that a hybrid unit brings becomes more valuable. However, if the gap in defenses is a swing of just a few points, then the relatively weaker combat stats of a hybrid unit compared to a specialist will not be made up for by exploiting the weaker defense, especially once the extra penalty of likely lower weapon ranks or other penalties get involved. If a hybrid unit excels both in strength and in magic, then that's just a singularly powerful unit. If it's an entire class that excels in both, then unless the class has some other notable weaknesses, such as low speed, low defense, or low weapon ranks, then the class will be seen as highly imbalanced compared to other comparable classes, and likely deserves to be more limited in access. The best hybrid classes manage to take advantage of both strength and magic in every combat they see through the use of skills. Awakening's Ignis dealing damage based on the unused stat, or Engage's Chaos style, increasing speed when fighting with physical versus magical units and vice versa, manage to provide reasons for the player to treat their hybrid units as hybrid units instead of solely specializing into one style, whilst also still benefiting hybrid units that are built to focus on one style over the other. In a game with class-learned skills, such as Awakening and Fates, hybrid classes can make decent places to give powerful and versatile skills, as their ability to attack either physically or magically means more units can potentially function in a hybrid class than can in either a fully physical or fully magical class. The Dark Flyer in Awakening, and the Malignite and Basara in Fates, all have extremely powerful skills useful for a wide number of builds, and being hybrid classes means that they're functional while leveling for most units, instead of feeling like a unit is being forced into a legitimately unusable class just to get a skill that they need in the long run for their overall build. There is an argument around if making a unit a hybrid can make it a good generalist class. However, in contrast to broad generalist units like Cavaliers or Wyverns, who can put forth a good amount of strength, speed, and defense without falling significantly behind their peers, and thus be considered some of the strongest classes, the need for a true hybrid unit to divide their stats between strength and magic means that their stats are often spread thinner than other generalists. In games such as Engage, where every class has a set number of growth points, the classes that try to hybridize end up having worse growths across the board than those who specialize in one form of combat. This is perhaps a good thing, as if one unit class was capable of performing all necessary functions for your army, then that class would risk superseding all other classes. We often hear complaints about how Cavaliers, or especially Wyverns, are good enough to make other, more specialized classes useless in many situations, particularly on lower difficulties. If a unit had a similar level of broad effectiveness as a Wyvern, combined with magic access, especially in a game with reclassing, then it would be difficult to find a reason to use other classes. Or, the game would need to be made difficult enough to necessitate using other classes, thus making the hybrid generalist retroactively worthless again. And with that, what have we learned? First, splitting strength and magic matters immensely for hybrid units. If you don't split the stats, be very careful about giving any class hybrid access. Second, most hybrids prefer one combat style over the other. This is because the design of all the other systems and stats in Fire Emblem generally reward focusing unit into one direction. Third, hybrid units' versatility makes them very useful for providing reclassing options, particularly in games where reclassing options are more limited, or in games where reclassing provides skills. Fourth, hybrids are not the same as combat generalists. Their stats are spread too thin to be as strong as a Wyvern and as good as a mage, and if they aren't, they will become the only desirable class. Let the quality of an individual unit shine through in a potential hybrid build, rather than making a dedicated, overpowered hybrid class which shuts out all other classes. Thank you so much for watching the Complete Unit Design 101 series. It sounds cliché, but I cannot stress enough how vital my community was for inspiring these videos with conversations in Discord, comments on the channel, or chat in my rare live streams. After many years of beating my head against the wall that is YouTube with little success, this series has quadrupled my subscriber count over the course of the year. I cannot thank you all enough for tuning in, watching, sharing, subscribing, joining, and everything else that you've done. 2024 might not have been the busiest year for Fire Emblem proper, but I've seen more indie SRPGs and Fire Emblem fan projects come across my feed recently than ever before. While it may be trite to assume that I was helpful or inspirational to anyone, enough game designers and developers have come out of the woodwork to tell me specifically that this video series has been a significant help to their design process, if nothing else, at least as a jumping off point for discussions within their teams. To them, I would like to say, you are the jumping off point for my own videos. I do this for you. And it means the world to me that literally anyone would find my analysis of the tiny elements in an over 30-year-old SRPG series to be interesting or helpful in the slightest. And if you're one of those people who disagrees with every one of my takes, thank you as well for helping me grow a spine and learn how to defend myself. Not all heroes wear capes, and the strongest opinions are forged in the fires of opposition. And with all that, for the last time in Unit Design 101 and 2024, this is MythrilZenith, signing out.